Tēnā hoki mai koutou. Koutou e whakarongo mai nā. Welcome back to all that are listening. What a great session and presentation from those that have just presented. And looking forward particularly to this session, which is about learners at the center of the system. So this is a bit of a panel discussion. So it's going to be great to have a bit of a listen and hear the thoughts of our three panelists today. So I'm just going to get straight into it, and it is my privilege and honour to introduce Tania Winslade. Tania is the Deputy Chief Executive, Learner Journey and Experience for Te Pūkenga. So kei a koe, Tania, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe. Tēnā koe. Well, tōtahi, tēnei te mihi ki a koe, Lee. Thank you for your manaaki at our hui today, and I'd also like to acknowledge everyone else who's gone before us today, the ministers and other leaders, and also to the RoVE team for putting this together, and to everyone online today. It's so wonderful to hear the passion that exists out in our sector, and to those of you who've been on this journey and this kaupapa for a long time. For some of us, it precedes ourselves. Tēnā tātou. As Minister Hitkins mentioned this morning, we're putting learners at the centre of the system, and we are required to do this. Iona mentioned that our learners are ambitious and expect more, and they certainly do. So really pleased to be here today with both Andrew Lissels and Jordan Goosh.
Tēnā koe, Tania. Ka pai. I would now like to introduce Andrew Lissels, who is the National President of the New Zealand Union of Students Associations. His entry into the student movement was through the Eastern Institute of Technology Students Association, where he served as president in 2019 and 2020. Andrew, tēnā koe.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for being here all today, and for providing learners the opportunity to speak in this hui as well. I think it's really important that we do hear learners throughout the journey in RoVE, and as you've heard from me, my background is in the project sector, and it's a sector that I'm immensely proud to be a part of, and it's a sector that I know how much we can succeed when we listen to our learners, and that's why it's an immense privilege to really be creating a system that is learner-centric. We know through the reforms that we've seen thus far, we know what doesn't work, we know what does work, and we know that often the people who are best at identifying what those things are actually learners. And that's what's so exciting about these reforms, is the fact that we can hear the voices of learners in everything we do. We can actually use learners as the experts at being learners, and really focus our efforts on building a system that works around them and works for them, rather than a system that they have to challenge every time, and they are challenged to engage in. And that's what's the immense opportunity that we have with RoVE. And yeah, it's an immense pleasure to be here today.
Tēnā koe, Andrew. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. I was also going to introduce Darian Watine. Unfortunately, Darian is fallen a little bit ill today. He was one of our students as part of our Nordic Student Learner Voice. So, kia pai ki te ora, kia pai ki te kaha ki a koe, Darian. However, we are fortunate to have Jordan Goosh. Jordan Goosh, a BCITO apprentice, an interim learning advisor committee co-chair, and a Pūkenga council member. Jordan, nei mai haere mai e hoa.
Kia ora koutou. Talofa everyone. Thank you for inviting us all to be here today. It's a great privilege to be here, and listening in on the past couple of sessions has been good. But yeah, just really here to provide a learner voice in this sector, and that we're trying to make the change for us that, you know, as Tania has said, that we're at the centre. So looking forward to answering a few questions and just being here today. So thank you.
Tēnā koe. Well, it's great having you here, Jordan, actually all of you. So I've got a few questions here, and I encourage everybody to continue using the Q&A function. And don't forget, if you do have any technical issues, please yell out to Stuart Challis, TWZ Elevate. Pātai tuatahi ki a koe, Tania.
Kia ora.
How is Te Pūkenga changing the nature of the relationship that a TEO has with learners? So how are you involving them in the change process so that they can influence the learner experience?
Yeah, kia ora. We heard Hinarangi talk earlier today about co-designing with our mokopuna and thinking about future generations. And we also heard from a number of speakers the need to not just pilot things and tack things on the end. And so we've really been challenging ourselves to unlearn things and also learn new things in the process as a fairly young organisation at Te Pukenga. And we all talk quite often about how learners are at the centre of the system. But what does that actually mean, and what does it look like in daily practice? And for us at Te Pukenga, the journey that we've been on simply means that learners have to be active agents who bring their own knowledge, experiences, learning, and ideas to improve the learner experience. And as others have touched on, that you can't separate the learner from whānau, so we need to make sure that we've got more whānau inclusive practices. We started out by something which seems to be quite novel to some, which is let's just go and ask our learners what they think. So that led to our world-leading research called Te Rito, where we really focused on all learners, but also in particular our Māori learners, recognising our commitment to Te Tiriti excellence, but also making sure that we heard from those cohorts of Pacific and disabled learners and others who we recognise are currently underserved by the system. So those reports really set the foundation and tell us what we need to do to enable success for learners. And this was facilitated by all our great staff across the network. We really recognise that the wellbeing of our learners is also dependent on the wellbeing of our staff. And they have those fundamental relationships with learners. And so working across our network to do that in the most appropriate way. As many others have talked about today, we applied our Te Tiriti excellence framework, so building on the learner success framework that Morgan was talking about, but recognising that we need to take a different approach to co-design because this is Aotearoa New Zealand and there are things that make us unique. For context, around 20% of our 230,000 learners are Māori come 2023 and around 9% Pacific peoples. We know about 10% are disabled learners, which is less than the New Zealand population. So it suggests to us that we need to do better in terms of making safe environments for learners to disclose those things to us. So the approach we took was to then analyse what our learners were saying with Māori and Pacific researchers. And what did they tell us? They spoke to all aspects of our system, right from governance to what quality teaching and learning is, how services should be more whānau inclusive, how they want to be closer to the employers and outcomes for the communities, and some of the support that they want really early on. So we touched on secondary to tertiary pathways earlier, and how are we reaching out earlier and supporting with the right advice that fits that learner. So we're creating a more holistic view of our learners, and we're doing that by being able to partner with learners, other organisations and agencies. For example, nearly of the nearly 250,000 learners, we know that 60% of them care for dependents, and nearly 40% of our learners care for children. So what does that mean for the future organisation that we need to be, and the importance of reaching them now in meaningful and engaging ways? So the opportunity is absolutely huge, and it speaks to the need to take a long-term intergenerational view. So it's great to do research, but so what? What have we done with it? We've used it to develop tools and frameworks to support and build the capability of our network. And so the research is really informing our learner with whānau success plans, our equity strategies, and all aspects of our organisation over the coming years, including acting as a blueprint for how we design the organisation for 2023 and beyond. So talking to those time horizons that Stephen Town talked to earlier today. So we've got 4 priorities across our network, and we're bringing them together on those. 1, greater accessibility for all learners. in all forms, whether that's digital, information and comms, or physical environments. 2, making sure that we've got enabled teaching and learning environments. 3, holistic wellbeing and hauora, as we heard Tor in particular speak to this morning, and also giving voice and partnership to learners with whānau. In the short term, we're focused on key foundations which will set us up for the future. So, for example, for our Māori and Pacific learners in the network from 2023, we're looking at those whakawhanaunga activities and interactions which will create those welcoming spaces and help to build meaningful connections and a sense of belonging. We're looking at our mentoring initiatives and how we co-design and partner with Māori to make sure that we're giving the right solutions that are with Māori and for Māori and by Māori. We're also looking at how can we use our size and scale to connect learners back to their iwi and hapu through our systems, as well as representation for learners at all levels, which I'm sure Andrew and Jordan will have their own words to say on that. But over time, we'll see more changes to address equity and better support learners with whānau. So including the ability to seamlessly transition, embed mātauranga and have specific strategies and services, recognising Māori as our te tiriti partners, but also those who have been currently underserved by the system. We've got a learner engagement ecosystem, which speaks to how we include learners at all levels of our network, and our governance structures include learners. So really keen to hear Jordan's kōrero in particular about his experience as a full member of our council, Te Pukenga Council, and we're also clear that we've got a role to play in supporting learners who are in those positions. I'm not going to steal your thunder, Andrew, so I'll let you talk to whiringa ngā rau in detail, but we have adopted this framework, which Andrew will talk to, which really helps us progress from just having a learner or student voice to how do we actually partner with them in their learning. And what we're looking to do is to develop things in a way that asks what the need is first, and then thinks about the needs of the people that we want to serve. So flipping things on their head, and then co-designing with the people that we're serving. So I'd just like to end by saying we've done a lot of work when it comes to how you put learners with whānau at the centre and building on strengths of the current network. And so we certainly don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we're also happy to share those tools and frameworks and approaches with the wider network. So kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe I ngā kōrero. I noticed we've got a lot of questions and a lot of pātai, and we're really needing to push through due to the limited nature of our time. But I do want to offer Andrew and Jordan a chance to kōrero as well. And if I can direct one of the questions to particularly you, Jordan, and how do we ensure that learners are properly supported in the workplace to ensure that their learning experiences and time are protected there?
Oh, geez. We start off with the hard ones, don't we? Look, it's about being, it's about adaptability, I suppose. You know, everyone's going to have different situations, and we've got to be able to just have a voice to be able to speak in every sort of situation that we can. Like if it's from an organisational level to a governance level, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. You know, I'm privileged to be able to be in a position where my employer allows me to come and do these types of things. I'm allowed to be on the learner advisory committee. I'm allowed to sit on the council, and it's all down to his ability to let me do these things. So, you know, it's about adapting to that situation and being able to support it. So as long as we've got the voice to say it, and we've got the place that we want to say it, then we're going to be sweet. And yeah.
Ka pai, tēnā koe, Jordan. Andrew, I'm going to direct a big question to you too. So, kia ora te mai. And it's probably due to the nature of your overscope. You know, as you said, as part of the student associations across Aotearoa, I mean, particularly where you come from, the Eastern Institute of Technology is a very applied institution in the work in which they do. So we often focus on preparing the learners for work, but employers are not always well prepared for learners. There are many who are not prepared for the complex need, and especially our rangatahi, which are our youth, who are going into perhaps their first job. So talk to me a bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely valid point. I mean, it does go back and speak to the fact that we've had an education system that for over 100 years has expected learners to work around it. And we've also had in the system a really odd distinction between you have effectively academic staff who teach and allied staff who support a student. And we have this really daft disconnect between you teach them on this thing, we have these people to support. And actually, the reality is the best person to support a student through an issue they're facing is whoever is actually standing in front of them. The best person to support a learner through the challenges they experience is the person they interact with most frequently. So I think there's a really big capability piece that we need to do there with Te Pukenga to actually educate employers that they do need to be good supportive organisations. They need to have good workplace culture. They need to really address how they do engage with learners. They need to shift away from this mindset that apprentices can be used and exploited, which I know isn't the majority view, but there are still a lot of very disconcerting stories that we hear across the sector. And transitioning away from that to actually recognising learners contribute real value for your organisation. And by treating them well, you set yourself up for long-term success, and you set yourself up for having a valuable worker for life if you wanted it. And if you treat an apprentice well, they're going to stick around. And I think that's a really important piece that we need to shift towards, that recognition that they are really valuable contributions. And making sure that learners are treated as equals in that partnership and treated as experts on the experiences they're going through is actually a really important part of that as well. Because funnily enough, learners are the experts at being learners, and making sure we have a system that listens to that objectively obvious fact is something that's eluded us for 100 years, but shouldn't elude us any longer.
Tēnā koe, Andrew. And I'm going to stay with you actually, because there's another question that's been directed at you from our attendees here. Do you have ideas about how we can build and encourage a collective voice from students within the vocational education system, especially in the context of lots more online learning and WBL?
Yeah, and that's a challenge that we're going through across the student sector, is actually how do we derive that collective voice when you don't have students organised on a campus engaging collectively? You know, you can't just bribe someone with pizza to turn up to a lecture theatre and be bored to death about the student association, which is admittedly how my sector's run that sort of thing for far too long. So we really do need to think about what collective voice in these sectors looks like. And I think a part of that is actually making these learners in the vocational space recognise they've got a voice. Their voice matters. Their voice needs to be heard, and if their voice is heard, their education will be better. And that's something that has been stripped away from apprentices for a number of years. And if we look at the employment situations a lot of apprentices are in, they don't necessarily encourage the activation of voice from those students. But that is something that we as a sector and collectively need to work on. And I think that's something that WDCs need to be thinking about, that regional skills leadership groups need to be thinking about. How do you incorporate the voice of apprentices and learners into the skills needs for the future? Yeah, and that building a voice isn't just Te Pukenga thing, that's an entire reform process. And I think there's some really great work we can pick up on with Te Pukenga, and some really great work we can pick up on how they've captured that voice. But it's something we as a sector need to address collectively, otherwise we're not going to address it at all.
Ka pai. I'm going to offer you all three, our presenters, because we, pretty much running out of time, but bringing back learners to the centre of the system, bringing back learners to the centre of this discussion right here. Tanya, Jordan, Andrew, what is something that you'd like to close off the session with regarding keeping the learners at the centre of our system? Kia koe, Tanya.
Oh, kia ora, tēnā koe. Let's just be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about learners with the centre, at the centre. You know, like I said, like our communities quite often say, nothing for us without us. And so if we can stick to those simple principles, I think it will hold us in good stead. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe. Kia ora, Tanya. Kia koe, Jordan.
I think with keeping us learners at the centre, it's about this is a massive change, and it's going to take a while. Where a lot of us are under the pump, but we're be comfortable with being uncomfortable about it. You know, be ready to be the change. Yeah, because there's a lot of us that feel like we need it. Apprentices, work-based learners, online learners, a lot of support that's needed. So if you guys are ready for that, then let's go full steam ahead, eh?
Ka pai, tēnā rawa atu koe. Hei whakatepe ake i a tātou, and to conclude, over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think there's two pieces here, and one of the first ones is recognizing that to put learners at the center, everyone needs to be actively thinking about that. Everyone needs to be actively championing it, because if we don't champion this kind of radical change, we do fall back into the same old way we've always done things. And I was sitting here ready to pivot out a couple of my talking points, and then I realized Tanya had already covered them off. And that's actually a brilliant example of putting learners at the center, having a deputy chief executive of one of our major tertiary institutions stealing my talking points is actually a really good example of how we make sure that everyone puts learners at the center. But I think alongside that, and I'm going to use a prop, alongside that, actually going and looking at documents like Whiria Ngā Rau, looking at it's a document put out by NZUSA and our other national partner associations as an example of how to achieve student partnership. Looking at documents like that learners have actually produced, that learners have contributed to, and that learners have sort of told you how to do this sort of thing. Going and having a look at them and treating learners as equals when you're embedding them at the centre is a really vital thing to do. And actually embedding learners as partners in the change process is really vital as well, because we're never going to succeed in reforming something if learners aren't on board. But we know that students are quite good at driving change in so many different spaces. Why wouldn't they be good at driving change in their own backyard? And I think that's the real thing we need to do with learners at the centre. Have them as equals in the centre, not as something we sort of hover and levitate around. And that active partners in change is how we achieve real systemic change. So go and have a read of Whiria Ngā Rau, Progressing from Student Voice to Partnership. I promise you can't hear my voice too much in it. And it's a really great tool, I think, alongside a lot of others being developed by Tupūkinga and others in the sector, to achieve that genuine change and that genuine shift.
Thank you all very much. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. E tautoko nei, e hāpai nei tēnei kaupapa. Thank you very much for presenting on the learner and ensuring that we're keeping that very forefront and centre. So he mihi nui, he mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou. Watira tēnā tātou katoa. We have a little break now, a couple of minutes break before we resume back at 2 o'clock. So please go get your cup of tea, haere ki te whare paku, hoki hoki mai, hei te rua karaka, return back at 2 o'clock, and we'll see you for that session. Hei kona mai.